Welcome to Conversations with Transatlantic AI Leaders. I'm Karen Kornblue. I'm a distinguished fellow here at the German Marshall Fund and former ambassador to the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation.
And I'm Christopher Schroeder. I'm a global tech investor and entrepreneur, and I'm the new chair of GMF's board. I just want to say, in these historic times, it's never been more important to understand the intersection among policy, politics, business, and tech. Under our president, Heather Conley's leadership, GMF has stepped aggressively to convene leaders across the sectors to find a common language. As the transatlantic dialogue is one not only about geographic definition, but our shared interests and competitiveness around the world, getting this understanding right today is foundational for a very new world. Too often there's a growing gulf between tech and policy communities, never with greater consequence than with the advent of AI. And I travel all over the world talking to entrepreneurs and investors. There is palpable excitement about the possibility and opportunities here. But here in Washington, D.C., and many of the capitals of Europe, debate puts almost all attention to risk and treating AI as if it is one more new tech thing that may fit past analogies. I think it's a little understandable and important, but undermines an unleashing of problem solving without precedents and will release other unintended risks among our adversaries and non-state actors moving ahead of us.
These conversations with leaders in AI will hopefully demystify AI and grapple with how it can be implemented for the public good. GMF, the German Marshall Fund, is dedicated to the transatlantic ideals of democracy and rule of law. Our guests will come from both sides of the Atlantic because we know that the transatlantic community will be more competitive, more secure, and more inclusive if we master these challenges together. And we are really lucky and thrilled to welcome for our first interview, Reid Hoffman. It's impossible to do justice to Reid's importance to the latest wave of innovation and now to AI. I'm going to try anyway. Reid founded LinkedIn. He now sits on Microsoft's board, and he's been integral to the creation of many of today's leading consumer tech businesses, including PayPal, Facebook, and Airbnb. At Greylock, he's one of the most sought-after advisors, partners, and investors. His many books, most recently Impromptu, a look at the broad potential and ramifications of AI that was written with GPT-4, and his podcasts make him the go-to voice on where we are today. Reid also sits on a number of nonprofit boards, including the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, and he's advised politicians and policymakers on technology around the globe.
So Reid, we really are lucky to have you overall, and I thought maybe it'd be best if we would start by having you set the audience a little bit. I mean, it's hard to imagine. Impromptu came out just about a year ago now, which is a lifetime in any technology. There are two or three things that have most changed in that period of time that we should be watching right now.
One of the things that's pretty amazing is the speed at which kind of major new technologies and technological capabilities are coming through kind of the release of AI, because when the kickoff moment was the ChatGPT moment, which took actually GPT 3.5, now even 4, made it into an agent interface, and then made it a lot more accessible to people, and people suddenly started seeing what was possible. Now, we then saw GPT-4, and GPT-4 has a whole set of different capabilities that most people don't really fully know, which is, for example, being able to feed in symptoms and get a possible list of diagnoses, what might be medically. I mean, they kind of think of, like, because the press is like, oh, it can hack your college application or do your homework, both of which, has interesting evolutions in what goes on in education. But now there's also, how it accelerates coding, what's kind of been happening around, a variety of important cognitive work. So not just medical, but legal and other kinds of things, what it means for translation and transcription, what it means for like meeting notes and collaborative work process. And that's just the start of it, let alone getting to drug discovery and everything else. And so there's this kind of range of things. And that part of what I think we will see, this year is another kind of jump up in kind of cognitive capability sets that these agents and these tools will be doing which are part of the, kind of amplification of work. Now, I deliberately choose amplification because most people worry about replacement. And I do think there will be some replacement. I think there'll be a ton of transformation, which is not replacement, but it's also challenging for, individuals and work and everything else that kind of navigate, but with a very positive, outcome to the transformation. And so anyway, so I think that's the kind of thing we'll be seeing. Obviously, if you're watching AI, you'll see things like everyone's working on multimodal, like how do you have AI generated videos, not just images, but videos and that kind of thing. One of the things that, I've done some of is kind of demonstrating what AI tools um, for, for, for amplifying creators would be. Like, for example, when I gave this commencement speech at the Bologna Business School, I released it translated into 70 languages immediately. Yeah. And obviously, the version of how do I have AI be using my voice to be able to speak in languages I don't speak, for example, is something I've already started demonstrating. So all of this stuff we're really at the, like we've literally just put the boat in the water. Right? Like we're just starting all of the places where you can go in the journey. And so I think we'll see a lot of, we'll put the oars in the water this year too.
You've had a lot of experience, Reid, in sort of navigating policy making in and around technology. And I think 10 years ago, if we were sitting here, the view was move fast as you can. And when you have to get government to catch up with you, you sort of then talk to them overall. But we have something in this technology or something in the water that has had, a lot of tech leaders come to Washington ahead of things. We certainly know that in Europe and also now in America, regulators have moved extremely quickly to at least put down some markers. And what is the risk do you see this? I mean, if you could advise really thoughtful policymakers who want to do the right thing, with your experience in the past and the new things that are going on now, what would you tell these women and men?
Well, I think surprisingly, the greater risks are fumbling the future opportunities. It doesn't mean that there aren't real risks there too around, big things that can implement a cost. But like, for example, if you look at the general press dialogue on these topics, it's AI has hurt our democracy, is coming for our jobs, and might be coming for our humanity, and corporations are doing it because they're making a lot of money. And you go, well, and so therefore the dialogue around a lot of government folks is you need to slow this down.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I see a line of sight to a medical assistant on every smartphone. 8 billion people in the world, less than 1 billion have real access to GPs and general practitioners and for doctors. And yet you could then make a medical assistant that's available for everyone who has access to a smartphone or kind of equivalent. And then we just, like, it could be your friend's smartphone. Like it's not like you have to own a smartphone to get there. So that's one huge thing. An infinitely patient tutor on every subject for every age of humanity, whether you're 2 or whether you're 80, whether you're a professional, whether you're a student, all of this stuff, all possible. And so the real question, I think, is the most relevant one for risks for government is to say, by listening to the general panicky discourse, to be fumbling what the real benefit to humanity is. Because it's a little bit like if you say, well, we could have this medical assistant and we're not deploying it. Think about the number of children's lives, the number of possibly critical disease. You say, okay, well, we have this amazing amount of human talent around the entire world that's underdeployed. Think of what having a tutor could mean for elevating it some. And it's like getting that into deployed and into everyone's hands and iterating is perhaps the most important thing. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean there aren't risks, but one of the things that happens is everyone goes through their longest risks. It's like, the wise people and the elephant. And these people say, well, it's the trunk. And these people say it's the tusks. And these people say it's the ears. And these people say it's the tail. And these people say it's the legs. And you really have to triage that. So, for example, the most classic one is, well, facial recognition technology, may be broken in some ways and used in bad ways. And you're like, well, used in bad ways is definitely a possibility. And we can avoid that in its use thing. But by the way, facial recognition technology can also be really good for solidifying the banking system and payments and fraud and, kind of against, cybercrime and other kinds of things as ways of doing this. And so you're like, okay, that could be really good. And you go, well, but it under recognizes minority, faces. Well, that's iterative and we can improve it. It's not disastrous. So it's like, which of these things are in the, we should be improving them and paying attention as we're going, and which ones are like, oh, that could be a real problem, like bioterrorism or enhancement of serious cybercrime. And you're like, okay, those are the ones to limit. And by the way, those ones being limited, generally speaking, tend to speak more about why it's important to have responsible corporations doing this versus open sourcing. So like, for example, generally speaking, the advocates of free society, I myself was on the board of Mozilla for 11 years. I'm a huge believer in open source. Could I go, well, it should be open, like academia? It's like, well, but if it's an open tool that enables bioterrorism, cybercrime, rogue states, we should probably be a little more careful with it. Right. So it's kind of like, anyway, those are the kinds of risk. And it's roughly speaking, the overall frame is artificial intelligence is a human amplifier. Bad human amplifier is also what it can be. So how do we say, well, we make sure that it's in the good human amplification, things like, like a medical assistant, and how do we minimize bad human amplifier, terrorist, criminal, rogue state? And that's essentially where risks to navigate the limitation or containment of is particularly important.
Karen's going to unpack in a second with you a couple of specific opportunities, but just quickly on that, Reid, you're famous for being a master of understanding games and how game theories work and games incentives, and I've witnessed it myself, and it's extraordinary, really. In the game of Washington, people have said to me, Chris, you got to remember that the upside of incentive for anyone in policy and regulation is very little incentive, whereas the downside or countering the downside is massive incentive. So even if you could get some definitions among the two, any other advice you'd give about really understanding how to get this happen in a political, complicated, sort of heated environment?
Well, that's precisely the reason I speak so clearly about it, because the incentives are to say, for example, your average political leader is, I fear downside and I get no benefit from upside, so I'd rather stop the future. But if you'd stop the future, you'd stop penicillin, you'd stop planes, you'd stop, there's just like all of these things where the future is. And by the way, we'll have more tools with the AI system to help navigate both the upsides and mitigate the downsides of the future as we develop. So it's that getting into the future that's most important. And so you have to rely upon people's sense of desirous for not fumbling the future and not being, the reason why most Hollywood films tend to be dystopic is it's most easy to prey upon fears for this. What is the next robot going to get us? The Terminator, right? They don't necessarily think the next robot's going to get us the medical assistant that could help every child in the world, right? But yet that's more real, that's more high probability from the current technology set than the Terminator. And that's the reason why you need to kind of enable the right kinds of political leaders. But I completely agree with you. The natural thing, the easiest spot to occupy, whether you're a government political leader in Washington or otherwise, whether you're a media person, is to occupy the Cassandra role, right? There could be something bad in the future, and you should really worry about it, right? Yeah. And it's a little bit like, for example, if you were going to get in a car and drive from, Washington, D.C. to New York, and the way you were to describe it is like, oh, by the way, there could be slippery roads, someone could run into you, you could lose control of your vehicle, you could have a flat blowout tire, you could, let's go through everything that could go wrong. And you're like, oh my God, right? Like, hey, look, it's a drive intelligently, make sure the car is working when you get into it, right? And don't drive at 5 miles an hour because you'll never get it to New York, but actually drive at a reasonable speed. That's the journey that we're on. It's the how do you drive intelligently? How do you navigate risks, well for doing it? Because that doesn't mean, again, zero risk. There's this whole other line of technologists, which unfortunately I think has co-opted a line that I've been using, which is techno-optimism, which I'm a techno-optimist, not a techno-utopian, which is we can shape a very much future. It just doesn't naturally play out. And they've kind of grabbed the techno-optimist line saying, just accelerate's all great, all naysayers bad. You're like, no, pay attention to possible risk, rank order them to the ones that are real ones to pay attention to, right? Like, for example, make sure you're not tired when you get in the car, right? For example, these kinds of take a rest stop if you need one. But like drive intelligently, but don't like close your eyes and hit the accelerator. So anyway, that's the shape of it. And I think that the key thing is we need to kind of evolve the dialogue some so people don't just think that the only really relevant thing here is the government trying to stand for it against the technology companies that are building this technology for, basically only their own money. And by the way, look, money is great in various ways. And there is ways that it improves advertising systems, other kinds of things that, by the way, does have a derivative consumer benefit that most people don't realize. But like we're building products and services that could help change people's lives. That's the point.
Yeah, no, I'd love to unpack some of the opportunities. And I think there's a role for government in some of these opportunities as well, just because there are obstacles. And also there isn't always a profit incentive to some of the opportunities you're talking about. And the one I'm really interested in is you've talked about a renaissance in medicine. And not only that there's going to be more access, but that we're going to get solutions to rare diseases. So maybe can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, we know about the protein folding, but what exciting opportunities are there? And again, what are the obstacles? One of the things that I'm very familiar with is, the NIH gives grants and they don't require the data to be available. So how is AI going to be unleashed if they don't have access to the right data? But what are some of the other things like that?
Today, AI companies, generally speaking, try to make their AI assistants do much less in giving medical advice because of legal liability, right?
Yeah.
So one is to say, look, reshape the legal liability. Maybe you'll have to say, like, you must say, I'm not a doctor and you should consult a doctor if you can. But here's the thoughts. If you can't get to the doctor or things to raise with your doctor might be like you have to use that ritual in some way or something as a way of doing it. But like, that kind of thing could greatly enable things. Another one is, most focused. This is kind of like, nation run by lawyers versus nation run by people trying to create a better future for all of society. The lawyers are like, trial lawyers. They're trying to say, well, like, okay, we must have absolute lockdown, no possible risk of any individual human data, even individual medical data ever possibly being like, used without consent. And by the way, of course, it's an important principle, but you go, is that like getting to 100% on that is more important, or is getting to curing cancer more important, right? And so, like, what are the zones of appropriate level of risk and management to enable things? That includes, like, well, actually, in fact, we should try to create as many sources of data to cure cancer, recognize diseases, track the progression, like what things might be in progression against it, incentives on learning what kinds of things might be preventative, on these kinds of things. And all of that stuff would be in the version of enablement. I mean, that's one of the places where I think, by the way, in terms of AI, where China will have, some clear advantages against the Western system, because they'll say, look, what's most important is that we put all the data into a accessible form to make as many good medical advances as possible, and not as important to make sure that Reid Hoffman doesn't go, wait a minute, you used my blood test without my, explicit permission in your in your figuring out which of these blood tests are the right tells for incipient conditions X, Y, and Z, right? And therefore could be then acted on to mitigate some cause, right? And so I think all of that is in the kind of enablement we want to make happen. And maybe look, the part of the thing is how do we make that enablement happen while, of course, keeping our principles of individual autonomy, individual choice, individual safety, as part of this. But you've got to get to that kind of that aggregation. Now, some of it also may be around, like, we currently have all this discussion around copyright, of which I personally kind of think that it's like, look, the damages that copyright creates is you can't go, like sell versions of this thing yourself. I think that we should definitely make sure that that's not doable with AI, but they consume the information and then process that into something valuable. That's, I think, good. Well, then the same thing may be around, what are we learning and discovering? Because we discover this particularly good molecule in medicine. Well, how do we elaborate the space around it? Right? Maybe another similar. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm just curious about, paint the picture for some of our listeners who are in the policy space. What are some exciting things that you're seeing? And, what are there companies working on the drug discovery piece? Should there be, what do you imagine 5 years from now we're going to be seeing in this renaissance?
Well, there already definitely are companies. Microsoft has published some work with Novartis. There's, Google's work. There's the Baker Lab. There's a bunch of other stuff. So I think there is a bunch of things. I do think that part of that will be the question of, how do we navigate the both the incentive and ability to use AI to elaborate the things off what we know. So that was a little bit what I was gesturing at with the, we're going to see a similar battle with the copyright stuff.
Yeah.
Saying, I own the entire space around it, not just the thing I copyrighted, but any possible use of it, which is like, that's a mistake for society. And we shouldn't do that. Well, similarly, like not only do I own my molecule, but I own everything around it. And you're like, no, that's the same reason why you shouldn't say, well, like I can patent the human genome. Right, like I own the human genome. It's like no. The human genome is a common. Maybe there's specifics around it, but the general human genome is kind of a commons area that we're making progress on. I think we're going to need that within the medical discovery area. I think there's a whole bunch of stuff around, like, what's the process? We obviously want to be secure and testing in the FDA process, but what does that process look like now that we have software involved in it too? I think we'll almost certainly need to evolve. What are the ways to evolve it to balance safety together with the speed of delivering high quality human things, for benefiting humanity is, I think, one of the things for open for discourse. And obviously one of the general problems in a regulatory environment is that all of the incentive is on no risk, no error versus, and it's okay if it takes an extra 10 years or 20 years to cure a disease. And you're like, well, actually, in fact, like some trade-off of risk to save some of the human beings who are being slaughtered by the disease is a good thing. We got to be intelligent about that. And that would be also where we'll also have to look at this and play this out.
One of the things I thought of when you're talking about the FDA is one of the things I've heard about with AI is that we may be able to avoid some clinical trials, which are, such a bottleneck in the drug discovery process. But you're right, the FDA is going to have to think about how it evaluates success.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's like, it's perhaps there's a new way of doing clinical trials, right? And there's a new way of, like, for example, maybe there's a way of saying, hey, look, for example, with AI, we go through the following simulations, and that allows us to go into certain kind of prototype trials much more quickly, right, in terms of what we're doing. And sure, maybe there's a little bit of enhanced risk on that because we get the risk between the simulation and that, but that allows us that is perhaps in a number of circumstances an acceptable risk in order to go process and do this. So anyway, that would be the kind of thing I think we should really look at quite seriously, as a because the like it's not we don't want to minimize. There are real risks you want to contain, but like small risks, like for example, Reid Hoffman feels a little aggrieved about his like use of his personal data for a large benefit, right? Is the kind of thing is the trade-off that is you want to look at carefully, because the benefit to thousands to millions of people is the flip side of that is harm. So you want to get that benefit as much as you can.
Yeah, and it's so hard to update these rules too. So like everybody knows the frustration of going to a doctor's office and having to fill out the same HIPAA form that's kind of useless. But then on the other hand, our genetic non-discrimination laws aren't very good. And so people might be reluctant to share their genetic information, which could be enormously beneficial.
Yes.
But updating those is next to impossible. Yeah. So I'm a working mom and caregiver. And I remember back in the day, somebody said to me, "You're a working mom and you don't have a BlackBerry? How do you live?" And I feel like that's going to be what people say about AI, that, when you talk about, my eyes light up when you talk about AI as a personal assistant, and I know you're personally involved in this space. Tell me how it's going to help all of us and how we get there faster.
So one of the things I think is certainly going to be the case that we already see a bunch of it is there's going to be AI assistants and agents for lots of things. There's going to be AI and assistants in the workplace to help teams work together, stay informed, do things. Microsoft's working on a bunch of that stuff. There's going to be AI assistants for medical things, because, obviously if you don't have access to a doctor, you're really helpful. But even if you do, like hey, you've talked to the AI assistant and that says, hey, let's bring up X, Y, and Z to the doctor and have much more time effectiveness in the doctor going, oh, well, given the AI assistant had a 15-minute conversation with you and discovered X, Y, and Z, maybe this is the thing that we should really do versus so how you doing? How you doing? Do you have a headache? Kind of as a way of operating. Now, so I think that's the general rule. Now, obviously, one of the things that I've done personally on this is I think we will also have, as individuals, one or more personal AI assistants, personal intelligences. At Inflection, we call it PI for personal intelligence. Also, the pun is kind of deliberate. And already today, it can help you navigate a huge number of things. It can be anything from, my car is broken the following way. What might be wrong? Might I be able to fix it? What could be done about it? To, I have the following ingredients in my refrigerator. What would be a healthy thing to make for lunch? To, I had the following difficult conversation with my friend Chris or Karen, and maybe you can help me navigate that. And it's all of that stuff Pi already helps with today. And I think that part of the thing will be, kind of how we're human amplified and how we navigate everything, navigate our health, navigate our work, navigate our personal lives, navigate our interactions with other people. And I think what you want to do is you want to be thinking about how does that enhance? Like, for example, again, Hollywood tends to go the agent is going to try to take you over. It's like, no, actually, in fact, what we train Pi to do is not to say, hey, I'm your friend, you should only talk to me. It's like, hey, I'm here to help you. How do I help you navigate everything in your life, including have you seen your friends recently? And maybe you should, arrange something to go out and have fun with them, that kind of thing. Or speaking of, parenting, one of the things that one of our people at Greylock uses Pi for is kind of like the ask everything. She's the first time parent. Ask everything about she starts with, okay, what does this mean for my kid? And what does this mean? Should I do this? And how do I interpret this? And is this something I should be deeply concerned about or not? And you have an assistant that's there right then all the time. And doesn't mean that the assistant's always perfect and anything else. It's not like you seed your own agency, but have something there to talk to you and to be interactive and say, well, maybe we should go do a search on that. Maybe we should call a doctor, or, on this. All of that is enormously helpful in navigating your life. And that's what I think, not only is it coming in the future, but with things like Pi is already here.
2024 is a big election year, and it's a big election year around the world, not just in the US. How do you think AI is going to impact elections, and what should be done to ensure that it helps inform people rather than deceive them?
Ultimately, I'm an optimist on this stuff, but I think that our first pattern is going to be very challenging, because optimist case requires some kind of collaborative agreement as a country and as platforms to how to shape kind of fact checking. Think about how difficult the conversations in this country were around vaccines. Is the vaccine, evil or mandated or a sinister plot and all the rest, versus, we've been doing vaccines for a while, because otherwise things like the flu, kill lots of people, right? And not just the elderly, but lots of people. And so, how do we navigate all that? That is where it ultimately gets into a very beneficial place. But navigating that is a collective challenge that's difficult. And the challenge will be is that, actors like the Russians, the Iranians, and other folks who want discord and disharmony within democratic societies will be using these tools to attack the kind of information and cultural integrity. They want disorder. They want conflict. They want disharmony. They want people thinking that, vaccines are a sinister plot by the government to insert chips into people, or other kinds of, frankly, pretty wacky things, to be enabling all of that. And AI tools do enhance that in various ways. So I think these are going to be very troubled waters. I think it's the natural thing is to say, well, we just regulate against it. And of course, the various companies, Microsoft, others said, hey, we'll watermark our AI content. But this is one of the problems with the open source. With the publishing open source is that the open source can be used by anybody, can be used by terrorists, can be used by criminals, can be used by rogue states. And there already is open source technology of various sorts to enable that. And that's actually one of the things that I think is going to be, I think we're going to be in for some tough sledding this year in Western democracies.
Yeah, before I turn it back to Chris, I should just give a plug for GMF. We've just done a ton of work on disinformation and also the potential hazards of AI. But, I wonder, you've been involved in providing tools in the election space. And it seems to me that there's a role for getting local elections officials to have some of these AI tools that can help them quickly spot disinformation, especially about the electoral process, respond to it, to keep the confidence up in just how the elections are administered, and that they're trustworthy. Because it seems to me that's going to be a big attack vector, is this hybrid. We're going to attack the election system and we're going to undermine confidence in it. Whereas if AI tools were made available, they could be a response to some of that.
1,000%. And think about, for example, look, say there was some subset that sufficiently we agreed with as a society, where you said, okay, this is, the reason why we have, well-run, Western style democracies. Think of that as then included as an agent, not just for the local officials, but included in browsers, included in social media platforms. So if you see something, like you see an article, say, propagated by the Russian Times, people X are stealing the election or hacking the vote, in country Y, then it says, well, actually, in fact, here's some of the things that are done to make the system robust. Here's a set of different kind of panel people who are experts on this, saying why it's robust and how it works and how you can help it and so forth as ways of doing it. Obviously, if that was integrated everywhere, that could be enormously helpful. for the trust and confidence in the system. It just, we have to get it there and get it integrated. And obviously one of the things we have as a discourse right now is, and I frankly think these people are the opponents, like for example, within the American context, I think they're anti-American and anti-American democracy when they're generally speaking eroding the, falsely the confidence in the democracy. They're actually doing harm to the country as a function of it, and harm to our electoral process. And those people aren't going to agree to these tools being out there, for this usage anyway. But I think that's precisely the kind of thing that we should want as a society, because I think that's part of what, allows us to come together and realize we do have a democracy and we are participatory and voting in our futures.
Chris, why don't you pick it up?
No, I think just picking up on that, Reid, because I think I had this fascinating experience when I was in Europe a couple of months ago where a couple of friends of mine are very senior ministers, and they were talking as much about this in the way you and Karen have been talking about it, but also at the pipe and rules of the road perspective. And so one of them said to me, great, one more new technology that's going to be dominated by America. And the other person turned to her and said, well, maybe that's not entirely bad. I mean, France has a seat at this table. Obviously, with Mistral, there's a tremendous open AI competitor that's been well funded. Of course, everyone's trying to figure out how China will play in this. Folks are looking at the Gulf and saying that Saudi and UAE wants a seat at this. But in the end of the day, are we talking about an American and Chinese rule of the road that can have implicit competitive, if not conflict elements to it? Will this be spread in terms of the rules of the road more globally? How should we be thinking about the map of the world as this thing really begins to get traction?
Well, I'm really glad that at least some of the Europeans are realizing that as opposed to Europe trying to play the referee in a World Cup match between the US and China, they should also field a team. And Mistral is a competent team, because if you're the referee, you can never win, and people don't really people aren't always usually that fond of the referees. They're much more fond of the teams and kind of what things matter. And the question around, like, I do think that it's very possible. I think the French teams are very good. Mistral is one of them. It's not the only one. I've actually met with multiple French AI teams. I do think it's a place where many governments can participate. And I do think that it's important to enable, as part of, call it, Western style democracy policy, including the US, to have dialogue about what kinds of things would want to be shaped here. Because the same way that the US gets a lot of criticism for the areas where it falls short, but it's partially because it does actually, in fact, have an aspiration for a multilateral system. And I think that's one of the reasons why many countries and governments should, if it was just US versus China, should hope for a US solution, because it's at least much more multilateral than the Chinese system. Obviously, it's not as multilateral as could potentially be, but that's one of the things I think I value about the U.S. Ethics. Is like, okay, let's talk about how to make that more so in various ways, which still involve building it and not waiting, right? Like, let's not have it be a UN innovation process or a UN invention process, because that will never work relative to things. Now I'm probably going to get a bunch of UN, like, yes, the UN worked here. Look, not in technology innovation, right? And so, anyway, so I think that's very important, and I think it's important for us to get multiple countries and cultures' voices involved in it. It's one of the reasons why I think, Sam Altman spent a bunch of time going around to different countries and meeting with the governments. I think it's one of the reasons why, I myself has spent a bunch of time, generally speaking, within the G7 context, but also trying to help, various parts of the global South get involved in the conversation. So it's I think it's something that can benefit everybody. And look, here's a way of paralleling it, which is, yes, the large scale pre-trained model, which is generally best done off English, then does embody some things. But, and you might say, well, that's overly English, overly Western values, but it's like, actually, in fact, the human factor training on top of it, these things are highly learning systems. And I think you will say, what are the things on the human factor training on top of it, the human reinforcement feedback training, can then embody a lot of things from a lot of different cultures. And that can actually, in fact, be a good part of being part of the conversation. And I think that's doable. I think the most important thing is for people to start articulating what are the things they think are most important to include in what we're building.
We've taken so much of your time. Quick one for you, and then Karen will wrap with the question that we always do in these conversations, but what a perfect way to kick this series off. When I'm sitting having a meal with you a year from now, is this conversation the same conversation, only more so? Or do you think there are a couple of things that you see coming that we ought to be putting some thought to right now?
I spent a whole bunch of time on this. I do think the arc will generally be the case. I do think that the notion of a combination of how do we realize the benefits and how do we navigate against bad human actors doing bad things, that pattern will continue. Whether or not we see that pattern in rogue states and democracies, or rogue organizations and democracies, or through criminal behavior or terrorism behavior, I think we will see some more of that stuff, and I think that will be it. But I think the tension will include this, like I view the copyright lawsuits to be attempts over claims over ownership and economic benefits, which I think are generally speaking not very credible. But they could interfere with our progress towards, making a much better thing for all of society. And I think that's, my guess is we'll still be in that pattern. And where we'll be on the pattern will be leaning more towards creation of the beneficial future, or more towards more people coming out and trying to, get their own piece of the claim for themselves this piece of the future, versus claim for all of us this enablement of the future. As I think, I think we're still TBD in what we'll see.
Karen.
Thank you so much. So this is a question we're going to be asking all of our guests, which is what are a couple of pieces of content that you would, in addition to this series, that you would advise people to listen to watch, to read, to get a better handle on this field and what's happening in it?
So my co-founder, Mustafa Suleyman, wrote a book called The Coming Wave, which I think is very thoughtful. It'll also be a little bit more dealing with the concerns and uncertainties and shifts in society. So I think it's he and I actually we're both very much optimistic, but I'm kind of beating the optimism drum, and he's going, watch out for this as you're being optimistic. So I think that's that combination. I think Fei-Fei Li's book, The Worlds I See, is I think very good. Ethan Mollick has Co-Intelligent coming out, which I think is another of the really good kind of here's how we can enable ourselves. He's a professor at Wharton. And then, of course, I myself am making efforts of this with the podcast Possible, and and the various pieces of content that I'm putting out there about how we can make the world an even more human place.
This has been great. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Perfect person to start us out with, and so many threads that you've put out there that we're going to be pulling on as we go forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Karen, Chris, thank you.